Guys, let's get started. So, today I'm going to give you a market update and we'll also look at some really interesting opportunities that we might have this week or even in the next few hours or days, okay? Today is September 1st, Monday, the first day of the month. Yesterday was the monthly close. We're already starting the month with a lot of volatility and at the same time a lot of uncertainty. So I'm going to give you a market overview of Bitcoin and Ethereum. If the video doesn't get too long, I'll also talk about some altcoins, okay? So we'll be talking about both HTF setups, meaning higher time frames, and also intraday setups, all right? Let's look for setups in both time frames, all right? So let's start with Bitcoin. Looking at Bitcoin on the daily chart, what have I been able to observe? Bitcoin managed to sweep liquidity in this region, in these lows, and break the structure, right? So it formed a range for us so we can trade within a bullish range. From the very moment the market decisively reversed this significant flow, thereby making this crucial change of character, it clearly shows us that a substantial correction of this initial impulse is indeed about to happen. And precisely what does the price truly want once it actually starts correcting this particular range? It wants to sweep internal liquidity. And where is the internal liquidity here in Bitcoin? There is internal liquidity in the region of 107,000 and also liquidity at 105,000, okay? These two lows here are internal liquidity, all right? Why are they considered liquidity? Because the price broke the structure and these lows did not sweep previous liquidity, okay? Looking at the daily time frame, right? So what can we observe here? Could I set up a buy position and before the price sweeps the second liquidity, just because it swept the first one? I could. However, this type of buy is riskier, right? So we need to wait for a flow alignment. What would a flow alignment be? Flow alignment would be, right, a bullish shock, in this case, a bullish move, but on a lower time frame. So if the price sweeps this liquidity, you can move down to the 15-minute chart or the 1-hour chart and look for an alignment there that will give you a good opportunity, okay? But looking at the daily context, what we have here that's really interesting is this order block right here, okay? It's an external order block, right? An extreme order block. It's an interesting order block for us to be building a position, okay? So the upper base of this order block is in the region of 103,370, okay? So this is the region where we could be looking to, start creating buy positions, right? It's an interesting region for us to be building a position, you see? Yeah. The order block here is quite large. It's about 5%, okay? You need to calculate the risk carefully here, or else work with lower leverage if you're going to trade only within this order block without looking for a HTF, LTF alignment, okay? So we also have an interesting POC in the region of 104,170, okay? So this region would already be a place to start building a buy position, okay? At 104,170, you can already start creating buy positions, you see? With lower leverage because we're on a 4-hour chart, right? So we'd have to set the stop either below the external liquidity, which would be 97,900 or at 50% of the order block. But all of this here is a good demand zone, okay? So I'll be updating you guys, right? When the price reaches this region, I'll be posting updates in the VIP community, so keep an eye out there. Now, moving on to the 4-hour chart, we can refine things a bit more. What can we notice here? We can see a nice bearish structure, okay? An interesting downward channel. Yeah, and within this channel, right, we can see that the price here, look, it swept internal liquidity and broke the structure down here, okay? Actually, the structure break happened here. Look, it swept liquidity, broke the structure, and left us with an interesting range to trade, all right? So here we have, look, an interesting order block to build a position. Here, it's the same thing, okay? It was a bit messier move, a bit more indecisive, let's put it that way, right? With less direction. However, there's an interesting point to carefully note, which is precisely this. The price action conspicuously left this distinct wick here, okay? This specific wick in this particular scenario fundamentally represents internal liquidity. All right. And after this wick, we have an interesting order block here, which was engulfed, right, with an FVG. But the price in this wick came back filling this FVG. So what else could we look for here? We could also consider it as an order block, right? Since we're on the 4-hour chart, but it would be a lower time frame. It would be an intraday setup, okay? So it would be positions in this scenario, in this setup here. Look, you could set up this type of position here, okay? A very tight stop loss. I would place my take profit at the second liquidity level, okay, my final take profit. Of course, before that we would take partial exits, but the setup would be more or less like this, okay, to trade in this scenario. We could also set up a position in this scenario here, okay? A slightly larger stop loss, it would be 2%, but the take profit would also be bigger, okay? So that would be this scenario. Up to now, these two bearish setups, for them to happen in the next few days or hours, are looking interesting. There are also some interesting setups, but those would take a bit longer, right? That would be if the price sweeps the liquidity in this region here, so we would set up positions up here, okay? But then it would also depend why. Because if the price sweeps the liquidity of these lows here, the final objective of the price, right? If the price sweeps this liquidity and mitigates the order block and makes a nice absorption to reverse, the price's target will be the external liquidity, right? So it's possible, it's likely that the shorts within this region will get stopped out, right? But before that happens, if these shorts get triggered, there's great potential, okay? Small stop loss, big take profit, very interesting, okay? Let's go back to the daily chart now. What we have would be the following, right? The long setup here would be something like this. Look, on the daily chart, okay? It's more or less like this. Now, let's move on to Ethereum, right? Ethereum is also a very interesting altcoin for us to look for opportunities, okay? On the daily chart, right? We have a similar setup, but of course, the long setup is showing a nicer structure on Ethereum. The price swept liquidity, broke the structure, made a nice impulsive move, and left internal liquidity, okay? This low here is the internal liquidity on the daily chart, okay? So what does the price tend to do? The price tends to come down, sweep this liquidity, mitigate our POI, and make the move. Which POI do we have here? Okay, here we have the aught zone, right, which is between 0.62 and 0.79 on the Fibonacci. So that would be between 3960 and 3687, the aught zone, right? How could I build positions here? I could enter, right, at the upper part of the aught zone at 0.62, right, building a position at 3970 with a stop loss below 0.7907705 in this case, okay? This would be a setup with a very tight stop loss, you see? It would be something like this. I could set up this kind of initial setup, okay? If the setup failed, you could choose to enter at 0.75, that is 705, or opt for the order block here, okay? Which is also an interesting order block, especially because it lines up right with the POC, the point of control of the actual volume. It would be a very interesting setup if this setup here were to happen, okay? The risk reward would be attractive. It would be about 6 to 1 approximately. Yeah, but you know, within this scenario, if Bitcoin doesn't make a really strong downward move, it's quite likely that we'll hold, okay, between 0.62 and 0.705, all right? If it comes to the 0.79 region here, which lines up with the order block and the POC, even better, okay? Even more interesting. On the intraday, right, on the 1 hour Ethereum chart, we also have an interesting scenario here, okay? The price is accumulating a very interesting internal liquidity in this lower range, all right? So here we have a lower range and yeah, it's accumulating interesting liquidity in this upper part, okay? So if the price action makes a significant move like this, you could potentially consider taking a short position, okay, right around the 0.79 Fibonacci retracement region here. All right, this is in confluence with, we have to pay attention to all the details, guys. Confluence with the BPR, okay, on the 4 hour chart. Yeah, and we have an interesting structure, right? Because the price wants to sweep internal liquidity on the daily chart. So it would be a setup that you could trade, okay? Our risk reward ratio wouldn't be bad either. It would actually be favorable, right? Set your stop loss here. I can set the take profit at the liquidity, okay? So as not to be too greedy, all right? So it would be a setup similar to this, you see. Since these are intraday setups, they come with a slightly higher risk, okay? But it's a setup that can happen and has potential, okay? Other than that, what else could I look for now on the 4-hour chart? This top, okay, it's liquidity on the 4-hour chart, and it's also liquidity on the daily chart, you see? In other words, it broke structure but didn't sweep any previous highs, right? It's liquidity. But it's a setup that's a bit more external, so it's a little further away from happening. But okay, let's suppose the price makes the move, mitigates the zone, makes the move, and comes back, all right? In this region, sweeping this liquidity. It could happen, okay, that an excellent setup, right, emerges from this external order block, all right? It's a bigger order block, so of course you're not going to buy here and put your stop loss here. We're going to wait for an alignment or, make a second entry to get a better average price, okay? But, alright, it can also happen that the price leaves the region and doesn't respect this first zone, comes to sweep this liquidity, mitigates the block, and then makes a downward move, right? That's another possibility we have here, okay?